Welcome to Business Talk here on Business Tech, and we remain focused on the big issue, which is sustainability as we head into COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. Carbon emissions, obviously, and climate change and greening the economy are the big issues, with climate action failure cited by the World Economic Forum as a top 10 global risk. Now, in South Africa, carbon tax is one of the big talking points for business, and it's a reality. And companies are required to comply with legislation to report carbon emissions and pay tax on their liabilities. Now, the liability for carbon tax is anticipated to grow with time as the carbon tax rate increases and more focus is placed on the environmental impact of carbon emissions by industry. I see Jacinda Ardern over in New Zealand proposing to place a similar tax on the agricultural industry. But we have seen some businesses pushing back recently in South Africa, only to be rebuked quite sternly by the acting DG in the Treasury, Ismail Mamoniat. Well, to talk about this area of tax that's daunting for many businesses, I'm joined now by Tumelo Chipfupa, who's EY Cova partner. Welcome, Tumelo. EY Cova, a specialist tax division of EY that focuses on carbon tax and grants and incentives. So this is really your sweet spot. What is the carbon economy actually at its core?
Thanks a lot, Michael, and thanks for that introduction. I think at its core, the carbon economy, it's all the actions and transactions that I guess business find themselves having to get involved in as a result of wanting to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, mainly one as a result of regulations, but secondly on part of some businesses as a result of wanting to be good corporate citizens or good global citizens, and actually reduce the damage that human activity or economic activity is doing to the climate or to the planet rather. And all of this obviously has given to quite a tremendous amount of activity, either with people coming with new products that are more kind of damaging on the climate, or coming up with new ways of producing products that has got less of a negative impact on the planet. And there's quite a lot of activity or new ways of financing in such a way that, you know, you finance, but as you finance, you take into account the impact of the business that you are financing on greenhouse gas emissions. So there's quite a lot of things going on in the economy around reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And I think it's a trend that is going to accelerate, you know, as the world realizes that we've got less and less time in which to act if at all we want to prevent a disaster or of the global temperatures rising above what is safe for human existence on the planet. Yeah,
which is a very existential threat, and why it's receiving all the attention it is at the moment. When you look at energy efficiency in all of this, I was reading a very interesting article on the FT the other day about how through technology and innovation, increasingly developing countries are becoming a lot more energy efficient in that they're producing or using less energy for every unit of GDP that they produce. And so it's an example of some of the effects that we're seeing via decarbonization, but also just our general technological advancements. What is meant by energy efficiency, firstly, in this discussion around the carbon economy, and why is it important for businesses to understand?
Well, Michael, there are two ways, right, of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The one way is to look at generating power through means or through technologies that does not release carbon dioxide or methane into the atmosphere. And hence, people are looking at photovoltaics, looking at hydrogen. These are new sources of power that could, in the long run, replace fossil fuel power generation or energy generation. But then the other way in which we could reduce the impact of economic activity on the climate is actually to use the amount of power that we use use it much more smartly. That is, use power in a way in which we require less and less to get the same results. So energy efficiency basically happens when you use less energy, but you still get the same amount of service, or you get the same goods at the end of it. So it's really about using the energy that we have less wastefully in a much more smarter way. And that can be as a result of new technologies. It could be as a result of sometimes just behavior changes. I mean, we waste energy. If you drive into Johannesburg at night and you look at all the offices, you'll see that 99% of them are lit and using inefficient technologies. And, something as easy as just a switch that detects the presence of human beings can control or people changing their behavior and knowing that when you leave a room, you switch off the lights. It's ways to save energy. Of course, it can become becoming energy efficient, but it could become also much more technical in how we rearrange our production processes and so forth. So energy efficiency really at the core, it's getting the same amount of economic activity, but using less energy.
So how do we go about it? I mean, if that's the core of this, then clearly we need to be able to have a baseline. You need to measure it. How do we measure it?
The one way of measuring it, and actually that's the thing about energy efficiency. It's quite tricky because to say that you are energy efficient, it's actually it's when you say if a dollar had not made this intervention, I would have used 15 more kilowatt hours than I would have previously. So the best way of doing it is to do a baseline now of what is our economic activity and how much energy are we utilizing in order to keep that level of economic activity. Then you do an intervention, like you replace your light bulbs with LEDs, and a year later you say, I've done the same amount of business. Did I use the same amount of energy? And that way, if at all you've used less energy, but you've gotten the same amount of activity or economic activity, then you've been more energy efficient. I'm using lighting as an example. It extends also into producing goods and services. In a factory, you produce goods and services. You can do a baseline as to how much energy do I require to produce a particular widget. And if at all you do an intervention, 2 years later, you say I produced the same amount of widgets, or I produced more widgets than I did in the previous year, but I've used less energy. So that's really what energy efficiency at its core is, getting the same out or more output for less energy input.
And I think for investors, the importance here is on measurability, because if you're looking inside a business and you want to understand who's actually leading the charge here and who's a laggard, it becomes important. But when you advise clients, I mean, who are the key people who are asking these questions? Who's looking at the the reporting and the measurement of energy? Is it regulators? Is it just for C-suite executives to understand their position and to say, right, we've got to improve from this baseline? Who's asking and who's looking?
Yeah. So basically, there's a whole lot of regulation. There are standards that have been prescribed by the SABS and that are enforced and monitored by the South African National Standards Authority on how you actually measure energy efficiency. And there are institutions that are licensed to actually follow those protocols of measuring energy efficiency. And I'm glad to say that EY Cova, we are SANAS accredited to assist organizations or companies measure energy efficiency. But there are a whole lot of institutions. So there would be those regulatory institutions that are looking at making sure that when you make a claim of having saved energy or having become energy efficient, you don't go out there and actually hoodwink investors or hoodwink the public, that you've actually followed the scientific way of making that measurement. But then in addition to that, there are obviously other regulators like the Department of Minerals and Energy that makes sure that it prescribes, or increasingly they're making rules around minimum energy performance requirements for equipment. So you'd see that certain forms of incandescent, light bulbs are going to be taken off the market. You can't use them in the future. You will have to use more energy efficient lighting. Then there's minimum and also mandatory labeling of equipment. If you look at now and 10 years ago, most of the time now, if you are going to be buying a fridge or you are going to be buying a dishwasher, the manufacturers are required based on regulation to display how energy efficient that particular device is. And in South Africa, we are not as advanced as in other geographies. In other geographies, there are minimum energy efficiency requirements on automobiles. There are minimum energy efficiency requirements on motors. And I think increasingly, if one looks at the strategy of the Department of Minerals and Energy on energy efficiency, they are thinking over time of implementing those kinds of requirements. The one requirement that got implemented this past year, and it's going to become mandatory as of December this year, it's the energy performance certificates. So each and every building, certain buildings, offices, places of recreation will have to make mandatory displays of how energy efficient those buildings are. And that kind of labeling has got quite a lot of impact. So buyers of those buildings, people who are thinking of renting those buildings, can know upfront as to whether those buildings are energy efficient. It talks to the cost of rental over time. It also talks to the cost of whether a company wants to become a responsible company. So if you are a responsible company, you may choose not to rent a building that is, not looking at how efficiently it uses energy. So yeah, there are quite a lot of people looking, regulators, investors, and so forth, looking at how energy efficiency is evolving.
Yeah, and in particular in the green building space, I was hosting a Redefined Capital Markets Day recently, and there's a lot of talk around the green premium, so to speak, around buildings that have green certification and energy performance certification, certainly part of that discussion. But if you look at where we sit, and according to the IEA, I think only 6% of South Africa's final energy use is covered by mandatory energy efficiency policy. So we still got some way to go to ensure that we up our game and, to your point, become slightly more like Europe in that respect. So what are the ways that businesses can improve it then? And obviously, what you focus on as EY Cova is looking at the way government is trying to provide incentives and grants to nudge businesses in the right direction and to encourage the right behavior. What are some of the major ones that businesses can be made aware of and that can look to leverage in this energy efficiency journey that they're embarking on?
Yeah, there are quite a lot of incentives actually that businesses can tap into. I mean, obviously, as government makes more and more regulations, like the carbon tax, like EPCs, to act as a stick towards getting business to start conducting themselves in a way that looks at the environment. They've also made available incentives. And I guess the one key incentives that we've had since 2013, and it's the Section 12L Energy Efficiency Incentive.
Yeah.
And this it was intended really that as government collects money from the carbon tax, that money is invested into assisting companies in becoming more energy efficient. So at the current moment, any particular company that is a tax-paying company is able, if at all they embark on an energy efficiency program, they're able to apply to the Department of Energy, an institution of the Department of Energy called SANEDI, to get a tax certificate once they have been able to implement this project that reduces energy. And that tax certificate then would allow them at the end of the year to reduce the taxable income. It's a tax allowance that they can then use to reduce the taxable income that they have to pay to SARS. And it's quite simple as really getting an institution like EY, Cova, or similar other institutions in the market to come and assist you, do your baseline. You then implement your project. It could be a lighting retrofit. It could be changing an industrial process. It could be upgrading your car fleet, any form of energy. And once you've done the baseline, you've implemented your project, and you are beginning to realize the savings, then you can get that tax certificate and you reduce your taxable income. And the benefit is calculated at 95 cents per kilowatt hour, and it can become quite substantial and quite lucrative for companies that are, utilizing quite a lot of energy in their process. So that's one tax incentive. Another incentive is a grant program by the Department of Trade and Industry called the Critical Infrastructure Program. And the Critical Infrastructure Program is available actually for quite a number of activities. But it can be used for activities that enhance energy efficiency, such as, for instance, if you've got a paper mill or you've got a food company that is utilizing steam in their process, they can, they can simply build a bigger boiler, use the steam coming from the boiler to generate their own electricity, and use the waste steam coming out of the electricity generation process to use it in other parts of the factory, such as heating, such as cooling, such as cooking, and so forth. That would be in a food factory. And that's an energy efficiency that you could get a grant for that. You could also get a grant from the Department of Trade and Industry, from the Critical Infrastructure Program, for putting things like solar on your roof or moving to cleaner forms of energy. Other grants, yeah, it's quite a bit, yeah. Maybe should I stop here? I wanted to talk also about carbon credits.
Well, but that's that's what I was going to ask you about. So those are more kind of incentives and grants. What about, and yes, they're carbon credits, but also carbon taxes. We also see the stick approach being used. How are those working together, carbon taxes and allowances and carbon credits?
So first of all, I said the link between 12L and 12 and the carbon tax is that actually the taxes that are coming out of, in theory, at least that's how it works, the taxes that are being collected out of the carbon tax are being reinvested in the Section 12L of the Income Tax Act. So, to use the technical term, they call it the revenue recycling. They're recycling that revenue and making it available. But then also within the carbon tax space, they've got something called carbon offsets. So a company that has got a carbon tax liability because they've been emitting greenhouse gases, they can go and invest in a project, not necessarily within their carbon tax net, a project that doesn't fall within their carbon tax process, either in other parts of their company or outside of their company, and they can then use the savings from that, achieved from that project, to reduce their tax liability by about 10%. And obviously this would make sense if at all the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in the project that they invest in, the investment is less than what they would have invested had they invested in their own process. So I guess through the carbon offset mechanism, Treasury is encouraging companies to invest in areas where it is quite relatively easier to get reduction in greenhouse gases, because they recognize that in certain industrial processes, it will be very difficult to, the nature of the technology is such that you can only reduce greenhouse gases up to a particular point.
Yeah, the hard to abate industries like concrete, steel, those, and there are solutions, but they probably at least 5 to 10 years away from being commercially scalable. But I think the bottom line for any business is also, if you're export focused, that we've got carbon border adjustment mechanisms, the CBAMs as they're known, being put up and erected around Europe. And so potentially, if you're not thinking about this, if you're not preparing for this now, you could be cutting off a potential, export market into the future. But as we know, with load shedding, we should all be doing our bit to be as energy efficient as possible. And a great discussion. Thank you very much, Tumelo Chipfupa of EY Cova Advisory, partner, talking to us about how one goes about that, how you go about setting the baselines and get that certification. And then you can start implementing some of these projects for which there are a number of grants and incentives available at a government level. Tumelo, thanks so much for your time.
Thanks a lot, Michael. I really appreciate it. Thank you.